Late one humid night, deep in the Venezuelan plains, Javier drove down a winding, desolate road. His headlights cut through the thick fog, but the uneasy silence weighed heavy on him. The air was suffocating, humid, almost sticky, clinging to his skin like a curse. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, uneasy about the stories he'd heard growing up. Ghost stories. Things whispered in the shadows. The road stretched on, seemingly endless, with the looming silhouette of the forest surrounding him. Suddenly, a high-pitched whistle pierced the still night air. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but enough to make his pulse quicken. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing behind him. His breath quickened. The whistle grew louder, clearer. At first, he dismissed it as an animal, a bird, or the wind playing tricks on him. But the sound, that haunting, mournful note, seemed too calculated. It rose and fell in a way that unnerved him. The whistle. He'd heard of it before. A childhood memory clawed its way to the front of his mind, El Silbón. The legend said the closer you heard El Silbón's whistle, the farther away he was, but when the sound was faint, it meant death was near. The whistle, once distant and echoing, now barely registered. His knuckles turned white on the steering wheel. He didn't want to believe it, but the stories said that El Silbón appeared to those destined for tragedy, a sinister harbinger who carried the bones of his victims in a sack. The whistling suddenly stopped. Javier's heart raced as the silence felt deafening. He rolled up the windows, a futile gesture, and checked the rearview mirror again. This time, he noticed something, or someone, standing on the side of the road. A vague, hunched figure. His blood ran cold. "It's just a person," he muttered under his breath. "Maybe they need help." Against his better judgment, he slowed down and squinted through the thick fog. The figure was barely visible, cloaked in darkness. But something was off. The shape was too distorted, too tall and unnatural. Its head seemed to tilt as if aware of his presence. Javier's chest tightened, a growing pressure pushing against his lungs. He sped up, keeping his eyes forward. He knew it wasn't a traveler. His mind raced, trying to remember the tales. "If you hear El Silbón, pray he doesn't follow." Then it came again. The whistle. Fainter. Fainter. He turned his gaze back toward the road, gripping the wheel with trembling hands. That's when he saw it. Ahead, standing directly in the middle of the road, was the same figure, no longer hunched. It stood tall, grotesque, with impossibly long limbs hanging loosely at its sides. The face, or what should have been a face, was hollow, devoid of any features except for the dark, cavernous eye sockets. His sack hung over its bony shoulder, dragging across the ground. Javier slammed on the brakes, his tires screeching against the pavement. The car skidded, stopping just a few feet away from the figure. His heart pounded in his ears. For a moment, everything was still. He could feel its gaze, piercing through him even though the thing had no eyes. His throat closed up, paralyzed with terror. El Silbón let out a low, guttural growl as it dropped the sack of bones onto the road. The stench of death and decay filled the air, overwhelming his senses. Javier's vision blurred as his mind tried to comprehend the horror before him. In the distance, the whistle returned. Fainter still. And then, in a voice that chilled his very soul, El Silbón whispered, "Your bones will be mine." Javier's scream echoed into the night as the whistle grew louder, drowning out everything else.